Welcome to Between Two Chairs, Demystifying Commercial Real Estate, the podcast that brings you the latest insights and trends on the South Florida commercial real estate market, with your hosts, Fernando Arencibia Jr. and Jennifer Woolman. In each episode, we dive into the world of commercial real estate and break down complex concepts to make them accessible for everyone. Whether you're a real estate professional, a curious investor, or just interested in the South Florida market in general, Between Two Chairs is the podcast for you. So pull up a chair and join us.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Between Two Chairs. Thank you for pulling up a chair. With you, as always, is myself, Fernando Arencibia Jr., and the amazing Jennifer Woolman. Jennifer, say hello.
Hello, everybody.
All right, Jennifer, what do we have in the works today?
So today we're going to talk about appraisals because we've had some interesting situations coming up. And so just super basically, appraisals are a professional assessment used to determine the market value of a commercial real estate asset, right? They're used for obtaining loans, determine value of an investment, for tax assessment purposes, estate planning, all sorts of different uses. They're very, very valuable. They also contain a lot of information in them. However, appraisals are an art, not a science. You hear that all the time. You can have 3 different appraisals on a property and hopefully they all come in close together, but the reality is sometimes they can be really, really far apart because it depends. Again, here's that famous word we love to use all the time, the perspective of the appraiser. So there are 3 common approaches used to appraise a property's value. There's the sales comparison approach, which is basically just using comparables in an area. That's the typical kind of appraisal that you get mostly for residential. It doesn't always apply for commercial just because assets can vary significantly and they don't always have enough comps in a given area to compare an asset. Then there's the income capitalization approach, which discounts the income that a property is generating or could potentially generate, and it's discounted to a present value. And then the cost approach, which determines the cost of rebuilding what is currently there minus the depreciation to take into account the age of the building. So we're just going to focus on, and appraisers usually use all 3 of those to come up with a price, right? To come up with an estimated value. So we're going to go over the main purpose for appraisals today, which is for loans, and talk about some recent issues that you've had that you come across, because we always say that there's 3 points of negotiation, right, in a contract, at least 3, right? There's when you come up with the original contract price, everybody agrees to the contract price. The next area where a contract is often renegotiated has to do at the end of a due diligence period, depending on what is found during due diligence. And then the final one is if there is a loan on the property, or even if there isn't, and an appraisal is done for the investor or owner's purposes. If it's a cash deal, that's usually the 3rd point of renegotiating the deal. So you've had some really, really interesting appraisal issues, and it's easy to say, oh well, it didn't appraise, but you're always trying to bring value to the deal and to your customer. So tell us a little bit about the one that you had on a kind of a unique property in an area where they're, with very limited commercial inventory. And then we'll go on to another one, which had the business.
Yeah, I would first, there are major differences between a residential and commercial appraisal. But if there's one thing that they have in common is that an appraisal is an opinion of value. It is an educated opinion of value, but it is at the end of the day an opinion of value, right? So I hear a lot of clients, whether they're buying or selling, they always remark, right? That, well, the value of a property is whatever the market is willing to pay for that property, right?
Correct.
But of course, the banks want to be protected that they are not lending on a property that has a value that is way above, market value, market price, right? They want to be protected that if the buyer defaults on the loan, that they're going to be able to turn around and sell that property at the value that they were expecting. And so that becomes an important component.
Let me just
Sure.
point out, too, that what's interesting about that thought process is that it's always done in hindsight, right? Because it's based on closed sales. Well, properties, especially commercial properties that have closed, might have been under contract at a time where the market was vastly different from what the market is doing today or what the market is expected to do in the near future due to market trends and what's happening with inventory, et cetera.
Yeah, because to your point, and we've mentioned this before, what happens is when you look at closed sales, you're looking at lagging indicators. It's the past, it's happened. It should inform you and give you some direction and an idea, but a very savvy appraiser will also look at where the market is trending, and a perfect example is everybody knows that there were a lot of trends that were accelerated after COVID, and there was a huge upswing in value because we had incredible demand and we had very little supply. And so a savvy appraiser will look at that and understand the market is trending in this direction
Correct.
or that direction. Because it is an opinion of value, there is some element of subjectivity, and of course there's objectivity in how they break down the data, but there is some level of subjectivity that is involved in appraisal, and oftentimes you come through an issue. Another big difference that I think would be important for people to understand is that, the appraiser in a commercial transaction is always looking at what is the highest and best use of that piece of land, right? So that the valuation of that and the approach is very important. And what I also find very interesting is that most local regional banks, which are the bulk of commercial lending comes from those banks, they don't come from the big national banks, because the regional local banks understand their market better and they have a more of a hands-on approach.
Correct. They're more in touch with their community and what's going
They're more in touch
on.
with the community, and it is very common to see a loan officer in a regional bank that is going to lend on a commercial transaction to visit the property, to walk the property, to get a better sense of what the client wants to do with the property, which, as we will discuss, also affects valuation. So it's a hands-on approach, and as a result of that, they usually have long-term relationships with their own in-house appraisers, and I remember working on a deal early in my career with what used to be Continental National Bank, big bank in South Florida for many, many years, who has since sold to the First Bank of Illinois. Continental National Bank had an appraiser that had been doing appraisals for them for over 30 years. Mm-hmm. And so we were, running up against a deadline, and the appraiser was not going to have the report ready on time, but called the bank and told them, this is what I believe the property is worth, right? And I will have the report for you. Well, the bank trusts his opinion so much that we were able to close the deal before the bank got the report.
Wow.
Which is, almost
that's
unheard of, right? And that speaks to the relationship. So those are some of the things that are differentiating factors here.
Well, and I also want to point out how important where the appraiser is located is from, because I had an appraisal for people who aren't in South Florida. I had an appraiser come from Palm Beach. Well, that's not even, and my property was in Miami-Dade County, South Miami-Dade County. And I always ask where, the lender, where is the appraiser coming from? And then I immediately put in kind of an ojo, a lookout. And I let the lender know that I said, look, the fact that your appraiser isn't even from the neighboring county, let alone not from the county where the property is, if this appraisal is off, I'm going to file that I'm going to want it reevaluated right away. So I'm leaving it up to you as to whether you want to assign another appraiser. But I had already put them on notice because totally different markets, right? Yeah. And so I was very concerned that, and that wasn't a local lender, right?
And you're bringing up a point that I think is very important, which is that we have access. So over 89% of all property searches begin online. And now we have access like never before to more data about a neighborhood, about an area, about a property than we've ever had before. That does not take the place of getting in your car, foot on the ground, understand the area. And to your point, I had an appraiser come to value a property in Westchester, which is close to Kendall, Florida, from Deerfield Beach.
Oh,
and
wow. Yeah.
he spent no more than a couple hours in the neighborhood, right? It took him an hour it was a big property, so it took him an hour to take all the measurements, look at the property, all that other stuff. He spent another hour, in the neighborhood, and then he left. And of course, to no surprise to us, the valuation was completely off, right? That is increasingly a problem. And if I may just, give people some background, before the Great Recession, before we had the housing crisis, there was a time in which the buyer could select the appraiser. A lot of the appraisals would have relationships with brokers, and they would offer their services. And it was, a great relationship in the point that you could always reach out to them and, get their opinion of value, do what we call a pencil search, give us some background. But then because the valuations were so off, the government determined that a big part of the Great Recession was started because the valuations were off. They wanted to create separation, right? So what they did is that now the banks are the ones that have to order the appraisals on residential transactions. The banks would always order in commercial. Now they have to go through a third party that orders the appraisal. So the bank is completely separate from choosing the appraisal. It's a third party company that chooses it. So sometimes they don't even know who the appraiser is until it has been assigned and that it's coming from another place. So, it's one of those unintended consequences. Well, on the commercial side, sometimes that happens as well, where they have a third party company that is going to make that choice. Or they have 3 appraisers and they send it out, and then whoever picks up the job, and sometimes they're coming.
Right, and it's first come, first serve, right? So it's kind of like an Uber driver. Whoever clicks first is the one who gets
the best price and the quickest turnaround, because that's another thing that I think is important for people to understand. Number one is cost. An appraisal, commercial appraisal, is going to cost several $1,000s. Could be very, very high, and it's going to take quite some time. You're not going to have a 1-week turnaround usually on a commercial appraiser. And that's not a bad thing, because I believe that it behooves the appraiser to do its research. Good appraisers are going to call and speak to the people that are foots on the ground and ask them about their opinion, review close past sales, ask all the pertinent questions to make sure that they are comparing apples to apples. So this brings me to your question about, so we have a transaction. It's a very specific sale because it involves what on the outskirts looks like a commercial building on agricultural land that is in an area that is predominantly zoned agricultural. However, this property is zoned as an education facility. It is functioning as an education facility. And the appraiser took the choice of wanting to compare that property to educational facilities through South Florida. And so what happened is they extracted the value of what they considered this would be the land value, and then they went about this approach of, okay, let's just look at this property in comparison to other schools. But it's very difficult to find that, right? It's not readily available. Schools don't trade all the time, right? And
if they do, they're not in the same area, on the same street, in the same general location, right?
And what I've always been taught about appraisals is that appraisers are looking for, first, proximity to the subject property, comparability, right? And then length of time, right? Because they have to adjust for time. If a property sold, and this is another common thing, because residential appraisers, they have access to properties that sold recently, usually they will have 4 or 5 comps within 90 days, very close in vicinity, then that doesn't become an issue for residential. In the commercial side, you often are looking at comparables that sold a year ago, that sold 8 months ago, that sold 2 years ago, right? And then the appraiser will adjust for time.
Based on the market and the interest rates, et cetera, correct?
Exactly. So the problem that we had with this appraisal, that they chose properties and schools that sold in Deerfield Beach, Boca,
Broward,
Palm Beach County.
Different counties, none in
Right.
Miami-Dade.
None in Miami-Dade, and there was no adjustment for land value, right? Because you could extrapolate and say the building is worth this, and then if you would have adjusted for land value, then we could have come to the right valuation. That could have been one way to do it. Another way to do it is to really look at, because we felt that there were plenty of comps in Miami-Dade County that would have worked out. The other thing is that we didn't feel that the appraiser, and again, we don't know if the appraiser did a walkthrough or not, but we didn't feel the appraiser really spent enough time in that area to really understand why it was valued where it was, right? And where the value is. You have an area where you have an incredible demand for that product, but very little properties that have that use and that have that zoning.
Correct.
And so a big part of the value is connected to that. So we had to, basically request for a reevaluation of that appraisal.
But when we got it, it had already been reevaluated. So we were asking for a third reevaluation, right? So the original appraisal, the reevaluation that they themselves did prior to you getting it, and then you requested a third one. So
But let's explain that to whoever is listening that hasn't gone through that process. So the appraiser is going to provide its opinion of value. The appraiser is following uniform standard guidelines as to how to prepare the report and how to present their findings. But there is a process in which you can ask for an appraisal review. And then technically what that is supposed to do is that another appraiser is supposed to, or a supervising appraiser is supposed to look at it, review it, and then provide their own opinion of whether the appraisal was correct or if there are other items that need to be corrected in the report. But what I find, and I really don't know why this is, but what I find is that rarely does that come back with a true, honest reevaluation, because when you ask for an appraisal review, you usually are going to provide some items that you want them specifically to look at. And usually at that moment, you also provide comparables and say, hey, I look at these comparables, we believe these comparables were not used, all that other stuff.
Do you know who asked for the first review? Was it the appraisal company itself that did it, or was it the lender who asked?
I think the lender asked for the review at the request or at the behest of the buyer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's interesting, right? Because the bank isn't going to be the one during a review providing additional information because they're the lender. Their viewing of an appraisal is totally different. It's not about issuing the loan. It's, to your point earlier, protecting their risk. So they're not going to go out there and do research and everything and provide it, because then that can come back and hurt them if for whatever reason something happens that they hadn't foresaw. So
they want to have a buffer, they really want to have a third party objective opinion of value, which it's completely understandable.
Correct.
And I don't know why this happens, but I've always, in speaking to attorneys, they always say that, judges are very reluctant to reverse rulings of other judges.
Of course.
And I feel that somehow, and again, this is pure speculation, but that perhaps there's a little bit of that goes on, where one appraiser perhaps feels reluctant to overrule the opinion of value of another appraiser, and they're just looking for technical errors, things that, as long as technically the report is correct, they're not really looking as in depth into the value.
And I get that, because we get those questions all the times from customers who have other real estate agents representing them. They come in and they're not sure, so they're like, hey, can you review what this person's telling me? And I usually say, look, I don't like getting involved with another professionals. You hired them for a reason, you trusted their opinion, and it puts us in a weird position because, again, my perspective on the deal might be different from the agent who has the information, and you don't know what information the buyer or seller already has with their own agent that we're not privy to. So I totally understand that, being across any profession, right? Where you hired the professional, trust them, you work with them. Correct. You don't know exactly what they used, and so I get that.
So the resolution for this case was that we had to provide our own appraisal review to the lender and ask the lender to reconsider ordering a new appraisal, or asking for another review. And based on our hard data in regards to comparables, but also some information really about the marketplace overall, right? Which is every market has nuances, and those things are hard to quantify.
Correct.
The market doesn't find it hard to quantify, right? And I'll tell you one thing that appraisers all often look at also to determine trends, and it is how long has the property been on the market, how many offers did you receive. They want to also understand the demand for the product, just to inform them and to color the way that they're looking at the data. I took statistics in college, and the professor, the first thing he said is that every piece of statistics can be manipulated to say whatever it is you want to say, right? So,
yeah, I did too.
So that exactly. So, that's the way it goes. But the appraisal, understanding what you're reading, I think that's a very important evolution as a commercial practitioner, is getting to a point where you really understand an appraisal and that you are able to provide a rebuttal if you feel that the evaluation is not correct. And that's a place where we can really add value to our clients.
Correct. And I want to give a shout out to both you and the buyer's agent, because both of you knew the market so well. You had already done your research and knew the market and the demand based on the research you did prior to pricing the property.
Right.
And the buyer's agent did the same thing when they were preparing to present the offer, right, to their buyer, because they don't want their buyer overpaying. You didn't want to have something either where you left money on the table, or worse, where it sat for forever and the listing got stale. So you already had that information. So the fact that each of you was so confident that this appraisal was so far off. It was what, $300,000? No, $800,000 off. Yeah. Like, that's a huge difference. The fact that neither one of you said, oh, the easy way out would have been, it didn't appraise. They already went to review. Seller, you either take this or not. Buyer, you either come out of pocket or not. And the deal dies, and we put it, that's the easy way, right? But you guys both provided so much value to your customers because you were confident in the numbers that you had given to each of them. And you went in and you provided all of the evidence. And guess what? The appraisal got turned around. Yeah. So kudos to you guys for not taking the easy way out and moving on to the next, and for providing that value and for having the confidence in the work that you had already done.
Of course. There's not a sense of desperation. There's just a sense of, okay, let me present it in the best way possible, because obviously, to your point, we were confident about how we were looking at the property. I also respect the fact that the buyer's agent did not give me any opinion of comparables or anything. He just said, I'm going to send mine. I want you to send yours. I want them to see that they're two different,
totally
separate things, that we're not mimicking each other, and for them to really understand that, hey, here you have two, professional, experienced commercial brokers that are giving you not only their opinion, but they're giving you, here are stats, here are comparables, here's all the information, and here's why we consider that you should redo the appraisal. And also kudos to the lender. Again, the value of working with a local bank is incredibly important, because you can pick up the phone, you could drive to the bank, and you could have those conversations. That would have been impossible, perhaps a strong word, but I don't think it's a strong word. But with a national or a CMBS loan, I think they would have been just like, hey, it is what it is. You guys have to, accept this value.
I agree. And I want to bring up another interesting part of that appraisal, which was that the appraisal had concluded that the highest and best use of this property was a single family home. To your point of it being an agricultural area, the zoning in that area, the regular zoning in that area, is one single family home per 5 acres.
Right.
And there were several properties in the area that had been listed for sale for a really long time at a really high price, because the only thing that they could do there by right was one house per the 5 acres. And that told us that that was not what the market was looking for, right? And to your point, the fact that it was already zoned for an educational facility, the fact that it was already being used for an educational facility. If somebody new to the area wanted to come in and put a school there, they're going to have a public hearing to change the zoning. It would be near impossible to do in that area. So we just knew we were like, there is no way highest and best use for this property is a single family home, when that's not what's trading in this area, and given the amount of activity that you had when you first listed.
Sometimes you just have to go back to the basics.
Correct.
You know, there's a relationship between price, demand, and scarcity. And there's a scarcity of that product in an area that has extremely high demand for it. And so, you know, when you're evaluating, you can't get stuck in the paradigm of, well, I can't find something that exactly is comparable to it in the exact same location. You got to be able to look at the intrinsic value that has, and always look at it from the prism of highest and best use.
Now, also, you had another one, and this probably would have come into play here too, because there was an ongoing business entity in the property. So you had another one where you sold the property, and it was an owner-user property, or it was going to be an owner-user property, and the appraisal didn't come in. It was also undervalued. So tell us a little
in that one, the appraisal did come in, because from the very beginning, the lender and the valuation service company that they chose did things the right way. But what I think a lot of people miss out on is that when a lender is valuing a property, or when the appraiser is valuing a property, a big part of the component, going back to its highest and best use, is what is the property going to be used for, right? And they also will take into account who is the owner user that is going to be occupying and utilizing the property. So in this case, this was a second generation restaurant. Restaurant was brand new. They had basically redone the entire restaurant. They brought it down to the studs. They redid the plumbing, the electrical, and the restaurant was only open for 8 months, right? Unfortunately, that's what happens in the restaurant industry. It's a very high risk, high reward kind of industry. And so the owner decided that they were going to sell the restaurant. This happened to be a freestanding building, so they were going to sell obviously the real estate and the fact that, you know, she poured so much into the building of the restaurant.
But she wasn't selling the business, so there was no key money. It was just
no key money. The property basically was vacant. The restaurant had closed, and so she decided to put it on the market. And so the buyer happened to be a regional restaurant group that had 9 stores already open in South Florida. And so what I found interesting is that when they evaluated the property, if you were to look at only the real estate value without its use, without everything that you want to take into consideration, the valuation would not have gotten there. But in essence, what the valuator does is that the appraiser will look at the value from 3 different angles.
Right.
One is, okay, the real estate. And to your point, they'll look at comparable data, but they'll also look at, you know, what the property can rent for, you know, what they can, you know, what's going to be the going cap rate in the area, and they're going to determine a value. But they also put a value in the FF&E, the furniture, fixtures, and equipment that is already in place, which is ready for a restaurant. The third valuation was that they determined, right, that this group that already had 9 stores, they asked them for, give me your average sales on each store, you know, over the last 2 years. So they provided P&Ls, they provided all that information to the appraiser, and so the appraiser determined that once this buyer moves into the property, activates the property, which was not going to require a lengthy of time because they were up and running within 2.5 months, right? They had to do very little to the place, and they were up and running. That based on the income that it was going to generate, they also added value because of it being an ongoing concern and the money that it was going to be generating out of that place. So as a result of all those 3, the valuation came play, and they were able to actually get the loan that they wanted at the loan to value that they wanted based on the valuation of the purchase price of the contract.
So that's amazing. And I want to point out to any of our listeners who own businesses in real estate, the importance of keeping good financials. Great books. Because I can't tell you, I did a deal last year, and when we asked for the rent roll and everything, I literally got copies of 365 checks. That was their rent roll. I was like, what about expenses? Oh, I self-manage. So, tax returns. Oh, I pass it through to my personal tax. The value of that property, to your point, I'm never going to be able to back it to show what that property is really making. Correct. So, that owner did himself a grave disservice because I wouldn't have been able to use a lot of the information that he provided to back it. And in your example, it would have been the same thing if your user had really lousy books, even though he just kind of said, oh, well, I know we're doing well because I put money in my pocket at the end of the year. Yeah. That's not going to count. They would have had done an income approach on the market, not on what that individual company was doing. So.
But I also, this is also where, again, this was another local lender. They've been around forever. They know what they're doing. And so when they request the appraisal, they requested all three valuations. So a savvy lender that understands their client, first of all, right? Because this was their client. They already have had a long-term relationship with them. Again, 9 stores, it's a pretty big operation for a regional restaurant group only in South Florida. Correct. Right? And, so they already knew, hey, I want these 3 valuations because I know I'm going to put all these together and we're going to be able to get, because ultimately commercial local lenders are very relationship driven, and when you have a relationship like this, you want to make it work. Of course. But this again is the reason why I just love commercial, because, it's so interesting and different, and what a different way to look at it, and the perspective, and the appraiser was fantastic. And I learned so much about how he was looking at things. And when we were working on the FF&E and we were looking at, okay, how much are you depreciating on the equipment, because the equipment had only been used for 8 months. And so that all those little things are incredibly interesting, and that's why it's it's so much fun to do this.
Yeah, every deal is like going back to school a little bit, right? Because no matter how long you've been doing it, you always get something.
But I will say one more thing. If you're a commercial practitioner, really, if you're an agent and you do any kind of real estate transactions, and you get a call from an appraiser that wants to confirm information about a sale that you had, answer those calls. Don't think that, this happened a year ago, I don't have the time. Answer those calls. That information that you're providing about the market is incredibly invaluable, and believe me, you're going to be on the other side of that. And that appraiser is going to call somebody else who closed another transaction, and that call and the conversations they have with that agent is going to help your deal.
Correct.
So,
Correct. Share the info. They're not out there to.
Correct. Give them the foots on the ground, perspective, for sure. For sure.
Alrighty. So what's your fun fact?
So I thought it would be interesting for people to know that in the appraisal industry, 50% of all appraisals are residential properties. Commercial appraisers represent a little bit more than 16% of the industry revenue. So now you say, okay, that's 66, 67%. Where's the other coming from? Well, the other coming from is business valuations, which is another big part of a commercial appraiser's, arsenal and revenue stream. And it is, when you're getting ready to sell a business, or you have a partner that wants to buy a portion of the business or wants to buy out the other partner, they usually will engage a commercial appraiser to do a valuation. So
for me, I'm going a little different route today. So in support of our small businesses, restaurants and bars, today is National Aperitif Day and National Mimosa Day. I'm not a fan of mimosas, but I like aperitifs. I always think, orange juice kind of ruins the champagne. So make sure you go to your local favorite hangout and enjoy a cocktail or a mocktail. Mocktails and other alcohol alternatives are more than a passing fad, thanks to Gen Z. The sector is expected to grow to $30 billion in 2025, according to Global Market Insights.
I love it, guys. Get ready to pay $18 for juice.
And watered down juice with some umbrellas and some fruit.
Get some juicing you for $18 at your local bar.
Thank you so much for joining us on another episode of Between Two Chairs, and cheers.
So you were about to say 2 chairs in between.
I don't know what I was going to say. I'm already thinking about my aperitif.
I love it. Thank you guys for joining us. Appreciate you, and thank you for all the feedback.